Well, hello there. Good morning, good afternoon. I don't know what time you're watching this, so good day. Hey, welcome to another episode of Booze and Culture, or another lecture of, I don't really know what to call it just yet, but alright, I don't know, I guess we'll just dive right in. I hope you all are doing well. But today we will be talking about really, kind of what is anthropology and what is alcohol. Just kind of introducing you to alcohol, because most of you don't know what alcohol is, right? Sure you do. But I'm going to dig a little deeper into it. So the way this is going to work, go ahead and open up your the PDF with your lecture slides in it. And I'm going to try to just kind of say, next slide or next page or whatever as we move through this. Instead of having another image up here in the screen, you can just follow along on your computer with your PDF. Or if you hate trees, you can print it out and do that. It's up to you. I'm not judging. So, all right. So really what we're going to do here is, normally if we were in this big classroom, I'd be like, what is anthropology? And I'd get a couple of answers, a couple of really good answers. But what is anthropology, right? I mean, most of you took this class because it's about alcohol, not because it's about anthropology. Well, so the next slide here is looking at, you got an image here of Times Square, two different images of Times Square. Because what we're really interested in as anthropologists is, we try to explore every aspect of human society, every aspect of cultures, and physical diversity across time and space, right? So it doesn't matter what time period we're talking about, right? Doesn't matter where in the world we are talking about. Like I was saying in the introduction the other day, if humans do it, we study it, right? So to continue on with this, what is anthropology? Going to the next page. Another description would be that it's a very holistic discipline that uses comparative methods to study different types of political and economic and religious institutions. And again, this time and space thing, it's the variation that is so fascinating. Because, if you think about how different it was just 100 years ago, talking to people, grandparents or great-grandparents or something, and they can tell you a little bit of what life was like in this certain town or where they grew up. It's vastly different. But that's just 100 years ago. But what about 2,000 years ago or 5,000 years ago? What was it like when we couldn't write things down and everything was passed on through stories? The idea of writing that popped up independently in many different places throughout the world, it transformed the way in which we're able to record things, the way we're able to document things. Just one example, right? And a more modern example will be, how this thing, how this phone that I love and hate, how it has changed the way in which we do just about everything, right? The way we do business, the way we communicate with each other, the way that we find mates, right? We find dates through this. So it's vastly different just in this very short period of time. But the way that I really like to sum it up in the simplest of ways of what is anthropology is that it's why we are the way we are, right? And I don't do the we are thing because of the Penn State thing. Even though when I say that in class, sometimes people freak out and yell it back. But we are trying to understand why we are the way we are. How did this happen? Right? And it happened relatively quickly. Because as you'll learn, as we talk about in this class, and when we start focusing on different geographical regions and cultures, we were all the same, small groups, small bands of people, extended family groups of 10 to 20 to 30 people, roaming around looking for resources as of 15,000 years ago. Really, as of till I got 10,000, maybe 9,000 years ago, people start growing a few things, settling down a little bit in the Middle East, and then it starts popping up in China just about 500 years to 1,000 years later. And it pops up in the New World later on. But we started to congregate, and we started to put down roots, not both real roots in the sense of crops, but with that comes permanent settlements. And that was just like 10,000 years ago. And we've been around for 100,000 years, right? And our early ancestors, it's upwards of 2 million years, right? So it's really mind-boggling to think of how much has changed in such a short period of time. Alright, so moving on to the next slide with what is anthropologist, of what we are trying to do, the questions that we are trying to ask. How did, like I just said, how did we originate as a species? How did all this happen, right? So the physical diversity that we see today, which is just the outward appearance, that has to do with our origins as a species and how we evolved over time, how we changed physically. But what I was also talking about earlier was how we changed culturally and how we're still changing. And one thing I'm not going to do in this with these lecture videos is I'm not going to hammer COVID over and over again for two reasons. One, you hear enough of it, right? There'll be some emails that I send out, some surveys of stuff that I want to know in regards to COVID, in regards to alcohol and COVID and all that. But one thing I do want you to pay attention to or think about right now is no one alive, well, maybe if they're over 100 years old or whatever, but then they were only like 3 or 4 years old when this happened. Nothing like this has ever happened before in the world. That people remember, that people lived through. That's why there's no playbook to go by. 1918 flu, it was the last time we had a global pandemic like this. And there were changes in behavior. But the changes in behavior we're going to see now that you will look back on. You will look back on, and it'll be 20 years from now, and you'll say, the reason that we do that now, you'll be telling your kids, they'll be like 15 years old or whatever, it's like, well, the reason we do that now, some behavioral thing, I can't think about what it is right now, right? We don't know. But you're going to say, yeah, that all started back in 2020. I remember I was an undergrad at Penn State, and all this stuff was going on, and we remember thinking it was kind of crazy, big deal. But there's going to be lasting cultural shifts that occur because of what we're going through right now. And that is classic anthropology. Okay, enough about that. So, continuing on with what is anthropology. If we talk about, in this next slide, of how North American anthropology is broken down, it's really divided usually into 4 subfields, right? And at Penn State, it's really just 3. With linguistics is kind of taught in a different department. It's kind of its own thing, but generally it is 4 subfields. So you have and the way I'll break it down like this. With the biological, right? It's the body itself, from genetics, right, to primatology, to the way in which we walk. Right? The gait, everything about our physical being is the biological anthropology, right? That's that subfield. The cultural anthropology, that's where you might go live with a group for a while, right? Where you might, and when you think about cultural anthropology, you're always thinking of like some small tribe in Africa that someone's studying, or some small group in Venezuela, like the Yanomamo or something that people are living with. True, that's cultural anthropology, right? But it's also going out to Beaver Stadium during a tailgate and interviewing people about why they're drinking, what they're drinking, and why they're drinking, and how much they spend, right? How much they pay for that parking spot. Looking at this and asking them these questions so you can get a better understanding of why we're doing what we're doing, why they're doing what they're doing, and better understanding American culture. So it doesn't have to be some tribe in some remote part of the world. The same is true with archaeology. Like I said the other day in the intro lecture, one of the things that I want you to leave this class with is not thinking about anthropology as this stuff that's exotic and foreign and weird, right? Because it's all weird. It's Super weird. And the people in other parts of the world, they're weird. And they think we're weird. Meaning we're all weird. So if we're all weird, are none of us weird? You see what I'm saying? We're much more alike than we are different. And that is the thing that I really want you to walk away from with this class. Is that if you can realize that how much more alike we are than different, once you realize that, then you can start understanding and appreciating the differences that we have. Because we're much more alike than different. And that's what anthropology doesn't just teach us. The data just shows that. That's what it is. It's just the way it is. So with archaeology, again, it's not just looking at, ancient tombs in Egypt. It's not just pyramids. It's not just projectile points and all that stuff. It's the iPhone, right? It's all the stuff that's left behind, right? So usually with archaeology, we're having to rely on archaeology to try to better understand a group of people that are gone. Now, that doesn't mean they're extinct, that culture is gone. Sometimes it is true that is the case. But sometimes, those people are gone. They've been gone for 3,000 years. They're not here to tell us what they were thinking and why they were doing that. We use the stuff, the clues that are left behind, the material culture, so that we can piece things together, try to put it together and make a clearer picture of what was going on in the past. But it's not just those ancient things, right? Like I said the other day, it's a beer can that was dropped during tailgating, right? And I said I wasn't going to bring this COVID stuff up, but I hope I remember again. But, trash pits like, they're called middens today, like when we talk about ancient trash pits, where people put all their broken pottery and all their bones and all that kind of stuff. We have landfills today, and there are archaeologists that do kind of modern archaeology where they want to look at life from the 1920s until today, and they go to a landfill and they put test units in. They dig down and excavate like modern, landfills. And you can see changes through time, different technological changes, from old radios to old TVs with giant thick TVs you can see all this trash. The introduction of plastics. Well, there's one crazy thing they're going to see in landfills when archaeologists do this about 100 years from now. There's going to be this really thick layer of masks. Just masks everywhere. I mean, not that people are already throwing them away, but I mean, once this thing is over, masks are going in the garbage, right? And they're going to go in the landfill, and they're going to be there for archaeologists to find. So, just throwing that out there. So archaeologists looking at the ancient stuff, right, that's left behind, the material culture. But now, to move to the next slide of why you're really here, what is alcohol? Now, as you see in this image that you're looking at here, it's just a ball and stick model of a hydroxyl functional group. But what it's showing you here is that hydroxyl functional group is bound to a saturated carbon atom. That is alcohol. Now, I know you're thinking, like, what? This? No, this is alcohol. True, there's alcohol in this, but it's just like 6.8%. I'm talking about alcohol, like the actual thing, right? So, and this is something, go to the next slide here, we're talking about, there's several different types of alcohol, but one we're going to concern ourselves with in this class is the drinking alcohol, or also called ethyl alcohol. Ethyl alcohol, or ethanol, is the predominant alcohol that's in alcoholic beverages, right? And we hardly ever drink 100%. That's just so dangerous that it would burn your throat. It's just, I mean, like, would really harm you if you were consuming much of it, more than a tiny sip. And there's no real flavor to it or taste or anything like that. So, but that is the alcohol that is in beverages that we drink, ethanol. All right, so moving on to the next one. And I love this because the etymology of alcohol, where does that term come from? So the term alcohol it's actually an Arabic word, which seems extremely ironic given that most Arabic countries don't drink today. The alcohol is not something that is consumed, but yet the term itself is an Arabic word. And this is also interesting because it also goes to show you how far back Arabic cultures go, right? And how influential they were all over Europe, North Africa, of course the Middle East, but all over that whole region, right? So very influential very early on, which is why this term is used. So why this term? Alcohol, right? Alcohol is just a substance that was pulverized or distilled. That's how the term ended up being used later on. So distilled makes sense, right? So, okay, if alcohol means something that's distilled, well, that makes sense. You could use that term, in reference to alcohol. But originally, alcohol was a very fine powder that was produced by the sublimation of this natural mineral called stibnite, and it was to produce antimony sulfide, which is like used in like fireworks, and it's kind of like almost like a gunpowder. It's flammable. But through this process of sublimation, so sublimation, not to get deep into chemistry, one, because I don't need to, and it makes me uncomfortable because I'm not a chemist. So the point is that with most transfers of one particular substance to another, especially from a solid to a gas, it's solid, liquid, gas, right? With sublimation, it's the process of solid to gas, skipping the liquid phase. So with this process, and you see in this picture, this retort in which this sublimation happens, you're heating this up and you're creating this vapor, right? It's directly from the solid. And when that vapor's done, it creates this extremely fine powder. That fine powder is alcohol. Now, to the next slide, continuing with etymology of alcohol. Alcohol, or al meaning the, cool meaning the powder used as eyeliner, is how this term was used for a long time. Before it meant something that was distilled. It meant something that was used as a cosmetic. So this black eyeliner that you see sometimes in the Middle East, which is highly functional in a very desert environment because it darkens the eyes, helping with reflection of sunlight. But it also at the same time is a cosmetic in the sense of making one look more attractive, right? But the functional aspect of it is to darken underneath the eyes. You might be familiar with this in the sense of from Khal Drago, or even Keith Richards, right? With the next slide here, the dark eyes, right? So exactly, guys, he's so hot, Keith Richards. Anyway, continuing on etymology of alcohol, with the next slide, we're talking about that term morphing into alcohol, morphing into this meaning of being distilled, something that's distilled or pulverized. That still doesn't equate it to the term alcohol, right? Like in the sense of this beverage that we drink. The earliest mention of this was this German alchemist, Libavius, when he published in 1594, Alchemia. He referred to vini alcohol. And when he referred to vini alcohol, so wine alcohol, but what he was discussing in there was distilling wine. So you take wine, and we're going to get this distillation here toward the end of this lecture, but you take wine and you distill it, and when you distill something, you're upping the alcohol content of it, right? So you're taking this 10-12% wine that's already fermented, and you distill it. So before then, things were just called beer or wine. They didn't necessarily think of it as having alcohol in it. The difference here, and the reason he's using it, is because it was wine that was distilled. And that's where we get the term alcohol. Interesting, right? How is it made? Well, Alcohol itself comes from it's produced by the fermentation. So, sorry, going to the next slide here. It's fermentation of sugars by yeasts, right? So fermentation itself is the metabolism of carbohydrates by certain types of yeast. These yeasts are everywhere, right? In the absence of oxygen. So with that metabolism of carbohydrates by yeast, you end up with fermentation, and with fermentation, you get alcohol. This is a great photo of, I took it, and that's not why it's great. It's a great photo because it's at Maker's Mark Distillery in Loretto, Kentucky. I'm very partial to Maker's Mark bourbon, and that is some sour mash that is bubbling away in a fermentation tank that will produce bourbon whiskey very soon. It smells so delicious. And there's a reason for that. And I'll get to that in just a second. Next slide. Talking about just what is alcohol. Obviously, it's a neurotoxin. It's a psychoactive drug. It is definitely one of the oldest recreational drugs in the world, and most popular. And if you didn't know, you can get intoxicated drinking sufficient amounts of it. Just laying that out there as a basic understanding. But moving on to the next slide, more importantly, okay, how long have we been consuming it? If it's something that happens in nature and it's always been out there, well, how long have we been consuming it? Well, definitely way before we were modern humans, modern Homo sapiens, right? Way before. Moving on to the next slide, because we see animals today that seek this out, right? I've seen it myself, spider monkeys down in southern Mexico on field projects, where what happens is that this fruit, like you see this in this image here, the spider monkey is eating this palm fruit. And what happens is that yeast is everywhere, right? Like I said before. But, it's on a blossom of a flower, right? And that blossom starts to form into fruit, right? And once that skin grows around what that blossom is, then there is yeast now inside the skin of that particular fruit, whatever it is. Well, in a certain environment, a certain situation, the fruit will not be eaten at a certain time. The temperature's just right. Sometimes the fruit doesn't fall off. It stays there and starts to, well, I won't want to say rot, but it starts to go a little south. It gets overripe. And when it gets overripe, it starts to ferment inside that skin. So you end up with essentially like a bag of alcohol that's hanging on these trees, right? It's a little liquidy, right, but it's still got a lot of fruit in it. But animals go crazy. They'll start almost fighting each other over it. This is not just something that happens in Mexico. There are a bunch of cedar waxwings, those really pretty birds that are here in State College, like fighting each other in this crabapple tree. And I went over and I grabbed the crab apples, and I figured I knew what was going on. I grabbed some of the crab apples off the tree. This is just behind Carpenter Building over by the Lion Shrine. And I crush it up and I'm smelling of it. I'm putting my tongue on it. I'm like, yeah, there's alcohol in this. And these birds are going crazy. Of course they're going crazy. It smells fantastic. It smells fantastic because all of us animals have evolved to seek things out. Our olfactory senses have evolved to seek things out of high caloric value. Of course we want things of high caloric value. And the reason this was a great thing in the past, this only happens like once a year for like a week, maybe. Think about what you would do if it was just this 1 week a year where you could have beer and it was just like growing on trees or whatever, right? The rest of the year they're not consuming alcohol. So they kind of overindulge. They kind of go crazy. And some animals, they can process alcohol and metabolize it so quickly that they never get intoxicated. Others, not so much, but they still seek it out. So, moving on to the next one. So this drunken monkey argument, it's really, continues on what I'm talking about here about that. It's a video, a YouTube, it's like 2.5 minutes long or something. I'll send it in a separate email, but just to kind of highlight what it's about. It's really the drunken monkey argument has to do with that we evolved partially because of alcohol, right? That the reason we seek out alcohol, and I don't mean just us as like Americans or humans or what, but the reason animals seek out alcohol is that because there is something that is enticing associated with it. There is a benefit that comes from it, right? And we evolved as fruit-eating primates. That's how we evolved. And sometimes we consumed large amounts of fruit that had alcohol in it, that had fermented on the vine. So it'll go a little deeper than that, but that's what this argument that this professor out of UC Berkeley came up with years ago. It's a really good theory on that can help explain our association with alcohol and the way in which we, for the most part, process it safely. Right? It's a drug and it's a poison essentially, but our bodies have evolved to be able to deal with that. So moving on to the next slide, which is, okay, that's how long it's been around. That's how long we've been seeking it out. In other words, forever. But how long have we been producing it? And that is the real kind of anthropological or archaeological angle here. What evidence do we have of when we actually started making it ourselves, not just worrying about finding it on a vine? This figure here, this female figure that's in this carved stone, she's drinking out of a horn. This was about 20,000 years ago. It's possible, but most people, if you're ceremonially drinking something, you're probably not ceremonially drinking water. And so most likely, she's probably drinking alcohol of some kind, but we don't have any hard evidence of this. So we can't really say 20,000 years ago. With the next slide is the hardest evidence that we have, which is in the Neolithic period in Jiahu, China, 7,000 years ago. 7,000 BC, so 9,000 years ago. And that's why we start with China. Next week there will be a lecture on China. We start there because that's where it all began in regards to what the evidence supports as the earliest production of alcohol. So these Stone Age beer jugs that were found in a burial, they were analyzed in compound residue analysis on them, and were able to determine that the substance in those jugs was a type of beer that was buried with these people. So, pretty good evidence, right? Of course you want to be buried with alcohol. Hell, don't we still do that today? I see it on movies all the time. People go up to some grave and they dump a little out. It always seemed wasteful to me, but I'm not that sentimental. But anyway, the compound residue analysis was done by this guy. He's a professor of anthropology at University of Pennsylvania. Patrick McGovern, also the author of the book that is recommended reading for this class. I used to require it when I first started the class about a couple of years ago, but I don't follow it too much in the way I give lectures, so it didn't seem, if you want it, you can get used copies pretty cheap, and it is a good book. So anyway, but Patrick McGovern, archaeologist, but he's the one who performed this compound residue analysis on those jugs in Jiahu and several others that we'll talk about here in a moment. And Sam Calagione, from the brewer and owner of Dogfish Head Brewery in Delaware, which a lot of you have probably been to. I haven't. It's just like right down the road. It's just like a couple of hours away. I feel like I've never been anywhere. Anyway, coolest thing about this is that Sam Calagione said, hey, with that compound residue analysis you did, can you give me like the ingredients that were in it? And he said, well, I can't give you the exact like recipe, but I can tell you what was actually in the beer. So what they make? Next slide. They made a beer called Jiahu, right? It is a recreation of the earliest beer in the world. It tastes okay, but it's kind of it's not really necessary, but it's cool. That's what it's in. It's cool, but it tastes okay. But okay, we're going to get here into move on next to the different types of alcohol. And a lot of you know this. We got your beer, we got your wine, and we got your distilled alcohol. Go through a little bit of each of those, and the history behind them, and kind of what they are. So moving on with beer, just to lay out a little, this little drawing here of these workers in Egypt. They were paid a daily ration of beer. Now, listen, it's not like they're paid. They're not drinking this 6.8% beer, right? They're not giving that away. It's like 1 and 2% beer. You'd have to drink so much of that to even get a buzz, but it has calories in it, right? And it's cleaner than water. It's safe, and it was so in other words, the pyramids were built with workers, slaves, being paid a ration of beer. So there's that. So moving on to the next slide of what beer is. Okay, it is, a fermentation of a cereal grain. And the reason it is the earliest type of alcohol, there's also honey mead, which I don't really talk about till much later, a couple of lectures in. But honey mead is actually another alcohol that was really around the same time period. There's actually some honey mead type stuff in that Jiahu. So it was around the same time too, but it's kind of like a beer in many ways. Kind of diverging from this beer thing, but I just want to say that honey mead is right along in that same time period that's happening. But with beer, so some sort of cereal grain, barley, wheat, corn, rice, any sort of cereal grain, you take that seed, you let it germinate just a little bit, then you dry it out, crush it up, get those sugars going, right? Because right when a seed is starting to germinate, all this energy is built up, and all these sugars start forming, and then you stop that process by drying it out. You crush it up, let it sit around in a container, a little water on it. Boom, it's going to ferment just like that. And so again, earliest evidence 9,000 years ago, in Henan Province, Jiahu. Generally, about 4 to 6% alcohol. In the early stuff would have been, it's 1 to 20%. But like generally, with the alcohols, with the beers that we're thinking about, even your Natty Lights, you're talking about like right around 4%. But a lot of the stuff that we drink now, that with the craft beer industry, a lot of them are 5.5, 6.5, 7.5%. So there's a little higher octane beers now in the United States than there used to be. Okay, this next slide says Life in a Beer. It's another YouTube video that I would normally play in class. I'll send you a link to that one too. Again, it's like 2 minutes. It's just kind of a fun clip on kind of the evolution of beer and how the role it has played in the development of different human culture. So it's fun. So I'll send that along. So moving on next to wine. This is a cavivre, which is a clay pot, huge. You can see from the size with the man there for scale. These are buried in the ground. This is in Georgia, not like Atlanta, but like the country Georgia in the Middle East. So they would bury these in the ground, dig big holes, and then bury these clay pots, and they would use these to age and keep the wine in. So they would age over time. So moving on, what is wine? The fermentation of fruit juices. Now, you already know, just because you like fruit, because fruit's delicious because it's sweet because it's got lots of sugars in it. So the more sugar it has in it, the higher the octane of the alcohol, right? You have more sugars to convert, right? So for those yeast to eat up and convert into alcohol. So that's why if you're making a beer, if any of you do make beer, if you make beer, you can always add little sugar. You can add things to it in order to add to that process to boost up the alcohol content. So it's made of some sort of fruit, right? Grapes, apples, berries. There's a whole host of things that you can make wine out of. Earliest evidence is 6,000 years ago, so 4,000 BC, in Armenia, so on the western border of Turkey. That's the first evidence that we have. And when we talk about, and I think it's the Russia lecture, we'll talk more about the cave and the first winery that was discovered in Armenia. So generally, the wine that we consume, 10 to 14%. It can range from, 10 is, I guess you can make it a little bit lower than that, but it's usually around 10. Up to 20, maybe you can get a tiny bit higher than 20, but not really. So it ranges in there, but I will bring up that when you talk about people like biblical times, or when you hear people just drinking wine all the time, and back in early Europe, they're not sitting around. People aren't drinking 10 and 12% wine all day. They temper it. They water it down. They water it down. They're drinking 2 and 3% wine, right? Adding that alcohol to the water, they didn't know that it was killing bacteria, but it did, right? And also, if you're sitting around drinking 12 and 15% wine at noon, you're not going to be a very productive individual if this is what you're consuming all day. So you're tempering it, right? You're watering it down. Just throwing that out there. People are like, oh, in biblical times they drank wine all the time. They did. It was really watered down. It wasn't like they're not sitting around drinking an 11% Chardonnay. Now, moving on to the last type of alcohol, distilled alcohol, which came around much later. So we've got 9,000 years ago with beer. We've got 6,000 years ago, so 3,000 years later with wine. Then when distilled alcohol comes around 1200 AD, right? So we're talking about like another 7,000 years go by before you actually end up with this creation of the new type of beverage. Even though distilling was going on earlier than that. So this image that you're seeing here with these alchemists, this is a little story that I like to tell just people when I'm, I don't know, on an airplane, even though I don't talk to people on airplanes, so I don't fly anymore. But anyway, this idea of spirit, like in Pennsylvania, these wine and spirit stores, have you ever thought about that? Like, what the hell's up with that? Why spirit? What does that have to do with anything? Because early alchemists believed that if you took, because before they were distilling alcohol, they were distilling water, they were making perfumes. That was a main thing that a lot of people learned distillation through some early alchemists that were making perfumes. But you could take rose petals, put them in water, and let them sit for days or whatever, and you end up with this kind of rosy smelling water, right? Then you take that and you distill it, and it goes through this process, of boiling and evaporating, and then going through a condenser, and it comes back out the other side, and it smells like roses. Well, essentially, in a very strong sense of roses, right? It's very strong on the other end. You've captured the spirit of that particular thing. That's what they believe. That somehow in this magical process, they had captured the spirit. So, yeah, sometimes when I've had some, I feel like I've captured the spirit too. But anyway, that's where that term comes from. Love that. So moving on to what is distilled alcohol. You start with the fermentation of anything. Think about what I was talking about with Libavius earlier in his book Alchemy in 1594, talking about vini alcohol, right? Talking about distilled wine, or vini alcohol, distilled wine. So this is anything, right? You can take anything that ferments, which is a lot of stuff will ferment. It won't ferment maybe into something like, I don't know, like I swear Crown Roos is made with wood chips or something, but you can be the judge of that. But the thing is, you can take wood pulp and it will ferment. And if you distill it, you can distill it enough times to change the flavor of it a little bit and just end up with a pure alcohol. So anything. But normally what people are taking is they're essentially taking beer and they're distilling it. They're taking wine and they're distilling it, right? If you distill wine, you're essentially making a brandy. If you distill a beer, you're usually making some sort of whiskey or a vodka or whatever, right? So potatoes, cactus, it does not matter what it is. Earliest evidence, 2 places. In China, and even though on the slide it doesn't say, also in Turkey around the same time period, you have distilling that's going on right around the 12th century. So this distillation, even though, and you see in this image here, that that the Greeks they were distilling water, they were distilling other types of things way earlier on, right around the turn, like in 100, 200 AD. This was around. There's no evidence they were distilling alcohol. And I also need to say too that evidence of alcohol production is really hard. Because what are you looking for? You're looking for like a pot that somebody boiled? Well, I mean, that could be any cooking vessel. Right? So how do you know they're making beer, cooking beer and not cooking soup? Right? I mean, like, it's really hard to find evidence of something that specific. That's why that compound residue analysis helps. Distilling, there is a certain type of device, right? A still that actually, enables this process. But again, we're distilling other things. Now with this huge change in type of alcohol production comes with a large change in alcohol percentage. Now we're talking about 30 to 50% with the stuff that we normally consume. 40 to 45 is like the prime amount. So most alcohols that you look at, like a bourbon or a vodka or tequila or whatever, is somewhere between 40 and 45, maybe 48. That's optimal. And they've just found this out over time. That distillers have found this out over time. That is the sweet spot, because that's where you can really appreciate the subtleties of the flavors. In other words, the art that went into producing that particular alcohol. You start getting into 55 and 60 to 65% alcohol, there's just not much flavor there. The burn overtakes the flavor, and so it's like, what's the point? And if the point is to mix it with juice, like some kind of jungle juice stuff, right, like a bunch of punch, then yeah, you buy Everclear because you don't care what it tastes like, and you're going to water it down with punch, so you're not looking for the flavor. But that's why that stuff is cheap. It's easy to produce, it's high alcohol content, and it doesn't matter. But it can range from as low as about 20 to, if you're in a lab situation, you can get it up to 100%. But usually with just normal production, people doing it in a backyard, it's going to be really hard to even get it over like 80%, 80, 85%. And then you're going to take that and you're going to temper it with water to lower it to 50 or 45% so that people can actually enjoy that. Another thing so this is the last slide. So the image is of a still, and just to show you how this works, I've been talking about it, but I haven't shown you this. So you take your fermented mash, right, whatever it is, your fermented liquid. You put it in this big tank, right, in your mash tun. They're calling it a flask here in this image, but put it in a mash tun. You heat it up. The boiling point of alcohol is lower than that of water. So the first thing that starts to evaporate is the alcohol. So it evaporates, goes up into the cap or to this outlet tube. That steam is then transferred in and pushed down into a condenser. Then you have cold water that's all around that condenser. That condenses the vapors back into that gas back into a liquid. And what comes out on the other side is alcohol. Now it can come out 20, 30, 40% alcohol. If you want it higher, then you take that and you can put that back into the mash tun again and start distilling it all over again, and you end up with a higher and higher alcohol content. And something that a lot of you don't know, and I didn't know either until, I don't know, maybe I was about maybe I was in my 20s or something like that, but I didn't know how all this was made. I didn't know that every alcohol that comes out on the other end, so it doesn't matter if you're talking about vodka or tequila or bourbon or gin or, God, I'm trying to think of all the different things. Rum, doesn't matter. It all looks like this, right? It's all just clear. You can see right through it. Looks just like water, which is another thing they call it, aqua vita, or the water of life, because it looks just like water when it comes out. It's clear. It's the aging process in barrels that creates this color, right? Some fine Jamesons right here, but it's aged. So the aging process for tequila, for rum, for whiskey, it all comes from that barrel, that oak barrel that it's in, and it's interacting with that wood, and that wood ends up giving it that caramel color, that dark color. Anyway, see, you learned something, didn't you? You didn't know that. You're going to tell somebody about that tonight. I know it. You'll be like, you know what? Vodka's never aged. That's why it's all clear. Don't drink whipped cream vodka. What are you thinking? Anyway, you can do what you want. Anyway, I think that's it. I hope you enjoyed this little overview. Next week we'll get into China, and I guess that's it. And listen, hey, I know most of you are going to drink, but when you drink safe, okay? All right, you guys have a good one.